As we cleared that, then we were directed to head toward the L side gymnasium. And as we approached there, we could see there was at least one body that I can recall on the yard. And we determined that that inmate was deceased. And so we were preparing to, and we were ready to go to make full entry into L block at that time. And then we were within, literally well less than 100 feet. We were heading toward that door, and they held one of the hostages. They pushed him up against one of the cell block, basically the window, and they had a shank to his throat and said if we came any farther, they were going to start killing the hostages.
Hey everybody, Pete Bloodworth with Corrections Unfiltered, podcast where corrections meets conversation. Tonight is episode 2 of our Lucasville Riot series. We were fortunate that when we posted episode 1, which was talking about incidents that took place before the riot with using 2010 hindsight, we had some staff members who responded to the riot reach out. Darren Price and Christopher Kemper offered to join us on this podcast so they can give us some insight as to what took place when they were there. I want to be clear. The information they are providing is from their perspective based upon their participation in the incident. There's no finger pointing. There's no blame. It's their perspective from what they saw based upon the information they were given. So as we get in this podcast, they're going to talk to us about some additional information that we were not aware of prior to the incident taking place. And then they're going to go step by step with us to the certain tragic incident that took place when the inmates took the life of Officer Vallandigham. So let's get in this podcast. Please like, please subscribe, please share, please comment, because comments are what makes this better. Let's get in this podcast. Well, hey, everybody, I'm back. Rick Harns, how you doing, sir?
I'm good, sir. Thanks for having me, Pete.
Good to have you back. Chris McConnell, how are you?
Great to be here.
Mr. Charlie Bueno, how are you, sir?
Good. Glad to be here for episode 2.
And as I said in our opening, we're also being joined by Darren Price and Christopher Kemper. Darren, Chris, thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having us. We really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity, and we appreciate you having us on today.
It meant a lot for us. We did the best that we could to do the research and for that episode 1. And when you guys reached out to us and we're talking back and forth about what you were involved with and everything, it meant a lot that you were willing to come on the podcast. So we do want to say thank you for that. And we understand that this is going to be a difficult situation because you guys are going to be bringing back an awful lot of memories. So thank you for being here.
Chris, Darren, first and foremost, welcome. What an honor it is to have both of you on Corrections Unfiltered. Why? Both of you were there, first responders from another facility. We, Corrections Unfiltered, Pete, Rick, Charlie, and I, we're not there, but we have dealt with similar experiences. What we discuss is based off our experiences and our extensive research through interviews, articles, television coverage, and documentaries. If we get something wrong, please correct us. As we say in corrections, good days give meaning, bad days give experience, worst days give lessons. A riot is beyond the worst. Lessons must be learned from this tragedy. Some good must come from this event. The deaths, both staff and inmates, cannot be in vain. There must be lasting impact. Again, this is not about blame, it's about lessons, and that's why we are dissecting every part of this riot.
We understand that there was some information that maybe that we didn't bring up in episode 1 that might also highlight some of the indicators that there were some big problems going on. You want to catch us up on that?
Sure. So about 3 months before the riot, so this would have been January of 1993, there was an Operation Clear Out at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility, or SOCF. And essentially, it's an institution-wide shakedown. And we received a briefing before initiating the clear out that there were some concerning actions that had been taking place, around that time frame. And so, for example, commissary cells were exceptionally high. There were a number of weapons more than normal that were being found during shakedowns and in common areas around the facility. There were a lot of protective custody check-ins where there had been a lot of inmates that were checking in more than normal. And then the number of assaults on staff had escalated. And actually, between the period of January and March of 1993, there were 10 separate assaults that occurred on staff, and that's what was reported. And so certainly, assaults on staff had increased. And so, we went into that Operation Clear Out with that in mind, that there were some concerns there. and we were there for a couple of days, as I recall, and doing this institution-wide shakedown where we did confiscate multiple contraband items from drugs to shanks and the like as far as homemade weapons.
Yeah, my first question that pops into my mind is, in your opinion, how was the staff there? Were they newer, or do you think there was the majority of them have been there for a while, experience-wise?
There's a mixture, but they had a lot of seasoned staff there. The 1987 to 1990 was a big boom for corrections in Ohio, so there was a lot of movement to the newer facilities, just like RCI. It opened in '87. And a lot of people from SOCF transferred there, a lot from CCI transferred there, and there was some movement, but there was a lot of experienced people at SOCF.
And I was in advance of this podcast, I was reading through. There's a book that was put together by Larry Dotson, which is one of the hostages that was held the entire time of the riot. It's called The Siege in Lucasville. And as I was just brushing back over that, he mentioned that there had been around 30 officers that had been recently hired in a couple of years preceding the riot. But as Chris mentioned, by and large, at that time, there were well over 400 correction officers at SOCF, and I would concur that they were some of the more experienced staff that you would run into. They'd been there. The facility had been open since 1972, so they had a lot of senior experienced staff there.
When you were deployed there, and again, I know that was quite a while ago. Did you get any feedback from staff that things were, kind of off while you were there doing shakedowns?
Yeah, so the staff was as well. So we had this overall briefing from senior leadership there at SOCF in January. That was once again 3 months before the riot. But then as we would go through the cell blocks, block officers would share similar concerns.
Some of the cell blocks that you could see in some of the old pictures post the riot, a lot of them looked like they were 2 tiers high. Was that typical, or did they go higher?
A 2-tier.
Okay. And
so as you went into each cell block, you would have cells on the left, cells on the right, and you would have, if I recall correctly, I think there were 20 cells in most blocks. Now some blocks are a little different, but as I recall, there were 20 cells per tier, so on each side. So then you're looking at roughly 80 cells.
So you could have as many as 160
block.
Inmates in a cell block of that size that you could see on
at
there.
That time, it was designed for, as I recall, 1,620 inmates, and they had around 1,800 or so the day of the riot. So they weren't all double celled, as far as 2 inmates to a cell. There were some, but the majority were single celled. But however, that being said, there were a couple of cell blocks during the riot that had been closed for construction and some security upgrades. So there were a couple of cell blocks that were not occupied at that time.
Like a day on the day shift, second shift, what did it look like for staffing in one of those cell blocks? Was it 1, 2, 3 officers?
Once again, I'll offer a general disclaimer. My observations and what we're discussing is purely through my eyes as a tactical response team member, but I do have some knowledge just based on acquaintances I have there. But generally speaking, they would have staffed a cell block with 2 officers. There would be one officer that would run the console. Another officer would respond if there were man-down alarms. They would respond within the facility. So by and large, there were 2 per cell block.
As far as during normal operations, not a lockdown, but normal operations. So you got a guy running the panel, running the door. I guess you're talking about the door panels because ours were always locked up as well. And then a responder. Can
you walk us perhaps through that day, your response and that first day of chaos?
Well, we got the call in various ways. We were scattered out. And once we got notified, we had to go back to our institution and get our gear and our equipment and our weapons and head down to SOCF. When we got there, it was just mass chaos, obviously. They took us to the visiting room, the inmate visiting room. That's where we originally set up our staging area. And that was probably about, I'm going to say maybe 5:30, 6 o'clock. Maybe, Darren, you think that's correct when we got there?
Yeah, because the riot happened right around 3, and my mother was a dispatcher at the Sauter County Sheriff's Office, and she called me at home probably 3:15, 3:30, and let me know there's a full-scale riot at Lucasville, which I didn't believe. I thought there's no way. If it's going to happen somewhere, it's not going to happen there. But she verified that, it was. She mentioned how many troopers had been dispatched there, deputies had been dispatched there. They were establishing a perimeter, and it was probably just a matter of minutes after that is whenever my pager went off. We had pagers back then. And so then I called in the institution, and as Chris said, probably I'm guessing somewhere around 5:30 is when we actually were there. We had to get staff brought in, and we had staff that were drawing supplies and all that at RCI. Then began deploying down to SOCF.
And once we got there, we sat around for a while. Like I said, there was a lot of chaos, a lot of, we really didn't get a lot of direction at first. We obviously didn't know what was going on for sure. I mean, we just knew it was a riot. And, we got more and more information by the minute, but nobody really had a definitive description of what was going on. Everybody you talked to said something a little different, a little more, So it was later on, and it was after dark before we actually went out and done the first tactical clearing of the yard. Well, first we went out and retrieved some bodies. There was two dead bodies on the yard, and we gathered up the crew that was available. Our team, what was left of SOCF's team, CCI's team, various. There was a couple of state troopers, I think, with us at the time. At the first, they were mainly doing perimeter and traffic control. Obviously they closed off the roads around the prison and things. So, but there was a few of them that came with us, and we went out on the yard, formed a wedge, went out past the bodies, let the EMS pick them up and take them back in, and then we retreated back in, with them, behind us. So that's the first thing we done. And the first two, I think it was the first two, Darren, when it was my dad. We didn't get in before my dad was there, did we?
No.
Okay. But we stepped over those bodies, let the EMS take them back in and everything. One of those happened to be my dad. I didn't know it for 25 years at that point. But we stepped right over him, and of course he was dressed in inmate gear.
They thought he was dead and they dressed him in inmate gear, or did they think he was injured?
That's what I was told, that they put him out as dead because he was out with another dead inmate. And I don't know why they dressed him the way they did. I don't know if it was just when it first happened that they dressed everybody that way. I don't really know. We couldn't hear anything. I mean, the noise, the helicopter flying over with the spotlight, and we couldn't hear anything. We could barely hear each other. I mean, really, we were using hand signals and things to communicate because we couldn't hear anything. So,
hey, Chris, what were you armed with? You guys went out there, so you got 321 inmates out there. I don't know how many are on your crew. How many staff would you say entered the yard?
At that particular time, just to get those two bodies, we probably had, I'm going to say, about 25, maybe. Is that right? That sound right to you, Dan?
Yeah, ballpark. And then once we went out onto the yard, whenever we removed the 321 off the yard, I'm guessing we were probably 40 maybe.
We were fully armed. I personally had an 870 shotgun and sidearm, and we had others that were armed with Mini 14 rifles and shotguns with various types of ammunition. We had
you went out lethal, not non-lethal. You weren't out there with L8s or gas guns.
No.
You were out there with the real deal. Okay, gotcha. Okay,
and that was the first time in my career that we'd taken live weapons into a facility. And now we did a couple times after that with other incidents that happened after Lucasville, but that was the first time I had ever in my career taken live weapons with lethal force into a facility. So, like as Chris said, everyone had a sidearm. There was just kind of a mixture from there, whether it was a Mini 14 or a shotgun.
So the goal then was to clear the yard of all human beings, whether they were staff or inmate, get them off the yard.
They were pushed into a gymnasium.
Yeah.
They were pushed into the gym? Okay.
Yep.
All right. And they were held there for the first night, or?
Yeah, they were strip searched and put on the floor under guard and until they got them all processed, and then they moved them out from there.
And there were some inmates that had created, some that had murdered inmates that tried to blend in with those
Right.
321. So they weren't
Yeah.
all, there were some that were heavily involved in the riot early on that tried to blend in.
Okay.
And through the investigation, they later determined that there were several of those inmates that were actively involved in the early stages of the riot.
Some of them, were in varying degrees of compliance. There some was hiding under. There was a lot of debris, a lot of sheets out, and there was piles of rubble. And sometimes inmates would pop up out of that rubble. You couldn't hear anything. There was smoke everywhere. They'd set all this stuff on fire. There was just all kinds of smoke. And you'd walk up on a pile of trash and sheets, and you'd think it was just trash and sheets, and all of a sudden a guy'd pop up out of it. How somebody, with that many people scared to death, locked and loaded, how somebody didn't open fire is a miracle. Well disciplined, well
Yeah.
disciplined.
Very much so.
Yeah, I just like take a step back. Whether you're in corrections or you're listening to this and you're really not involved in corrections, it's piquing your interest. Sit back and think about what that takes to grab a weapon, 40 guys, 20 guys, whatever the case may be, and walk into over 300 inmates that I don't care if all of you had weapons, they could still take you out and still
Yeah, because they were
overpower
still
you.
armed. I mean, there were still many of those inmates that still had shanks. So as they were going
Sure.
into that K-side gymnasium, there was a steady pile of shanks that continued to grow as they were
Wow.
being processed into that K-side gymnasium.
Yeah, and you can see that during the surrender, there was barrels that they had set up where they were just throwing their weapons in, and they were 55-gallon barrels. With just everything from pokers to spears, was in that barrel.
If you would, when you think about it, when you see that K-side gymnasium, we were out probably a couple 100 feet. I'm guessing, Chris, you think probably from that. So picture a half circle. And we
Yeah.
had kind of surrounded the inmates in basically a half circle. So you can kind
Okay.
of picture how that would look.
Okay.
But when we come out, where we actually made our entrance to the yard, when we come out, there was actually inmates behind us. So we had to kind of break up, form teams, and kind of move these guys, to the front and clear them out from between the cell blocks, and
Half of
that's
you
when
facing this way, half of you facing that way, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
And then we got back into the half circle and pushed them all where we wanted them to go. So,
And when you push those guys, you push them all over to that K block gym, and that's where this strip searching took place, and stacking them up, identifying them, counting them, and all that takes place there. Okay, gotcha.
So we've got them. We've got the quote unquote non-participants that are pushed into the gym and then eventually into K block, and then you've got every cell block in L wing. I don't know if I'm saying it right, but it looked like there's 8 units in the L block side, and those are all actively part of. Because I remember you had us look at that captive, the first episode of that captive series, and the whites were saying they had L1 or L2, and the Muslims had L8 or something like that. So everybody kind of parsed up their turf over there. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
that's
You had 3 main groups there. You had the Muslims, the Black Gangster Disciples, and then the Aryan Brotherhood. Those are the 3 main groups.
Right.
So your tactical unit was on site the first day, and I assume your primary responsibility was an immediate assault plan. However, during a full-scale riot, all hands on deck, many things need to be done. Isolate and contain, securing the perimeter and the remainder of the institution, obviously to prevent an inmate escape and to secure all non-participating inmates in non-affected areas. Additionally, you're retrieving deceased inmates from the yard for proper handling. And at one point during all this activity, your tactical team was within 100 feet of the L-side gymnasium, prepared and willing to make entry, but were ordered to stand down due to inmate threats of harming the staff hostages. Now, I was a member of the disturbance control team and the special operations response team, so I know you were biting at the bit, so to speak. You want to make entry. You want to help staff. You want to use your tactical skill set. Can you talk us through that?
So after we cleared the 321 inmates off the yard, we started clearing around the rest of the K side and the outside of the L side cell blocks just to make sure there were no inmates hiding in there because, by now it's dark. And so you don't know where somebody may be hiding. And so as we cleared that, then we were directed to head toward the L side gymnasium. And as we approached there, we could see there was at least one body that I can recall on the yard. And we determined that that inmate was deceased. And so we were preparing to, and we were ready to go to make full entry into L block at that time. And then we were within, literally well less than 100 feet. We were heading toward that door, and they held one of the hostages. They pushed him up against one of the cell block, basically the window, and they had a shank to his throat. And so if we came any farther, they were going to start killing the hostages. So at that time, there was a command decision made for us to back off. And so we egressed out of the area at that point. We retrieved the deceased inmate and took him back with us. But we egressed at that time. And that was the closest we ever really got after that to going in. I mean,
At one point, were put down in the tunnels. The inmates were trying to had to wait what we now know was weight bars. They were trying to beat through the concrete floors and get down into the tunnels. They knew there were pipe chases and the big tunnels, thinking that thinking they could get out, or I don't know what their mindset was, but we were down there and we were put down in the tunnels, and we're there to keep if any inmates did break through, which at one point we weren't down there then, but they actually did break through one of the cell blocks, and we were down there for a while. We were on the roof. Had different details, just trying to gather intel, really. More than that, a lot of it was just trying to gather intel.
And it would seem like it's difficult because you've got that operation going over on K to account for all the ones that were on the yard, and that's not a quick process. That's a long, drawn out, difficult process.
No, because we had to be out there until they were all inside, and they could only process them fast. They only had so many people,
and you didn't even have the area secured because they had the keys.
Right.
So that's
at any time they could have come out. We had to keep rear security to make sure that somebody didn't come out behind us and do whatever.
Was it true that they went into the gymnasium and tore apart the boxing ring and used the wires to tie the gates open so the guards couldn't run the gates from the pod house?
I'm not aware.
I'm not aware of that. I mean, it may have been, but I don't recall that. That wouldn't surprise me because, and you can see in some of the photos after the riot, I mean, they had different booby traps set up and they had different things wired because they knew that we may drop, tear gas in through the roofs as far as through the ventilation system. So they had blankets and different things in place to catch those. So they had, it wouldn't have surprised me. We knew that they had a lot of booby traps set up, and then they had punched holes in the L corridor walls. You couldn't see it from the corridor, but on the inside of the cell blocks, they had punched holes through, and they had spears set up. So if we would have come down through there, they had spears set to go at about thigh high because they knew we would probably hug the wall, or they thought. I'm not sure that we would have because we would have factored that into our operation order. But they assumed we would come down close to the wall, and they were planning to have spears to go through. They would stab into our legs because they were set at about thigh high.
That's those Vietnam veterans.
Yeah.
Yep.
One of the big things one of the big things they did too is they took the individual bunk beds with the mattress frames, the springs and such, and they made walls out of those, wired them, tied them together, and running from one side of the cell block to another at various points to slow people down getting in.
So essentially, you had a maze inside of those cell blocks. Everything that they had in place, we anticipated. So we knew that they would probably have something along the wall. So we had already discussed that. We knew that they would have something in place to try to capture any canisters that went into the ventilation system. We knew that they would have some type of maze or certainly something to make it difficult on us to go in to the cell blocks had we actually made entry. We anticipated that.
Is there a point where some type of chain of command or some kind of structure being built on who's responsible for what and where they're going to be and the establishment of shifts and who's going to go home and rest versus who's going to stay inside and continue to fight?
Based on what
Yeah.
I read in the season, Lucasville, Warden Tate would have arrived around 6 p.m. And
Yes.
so at that point is when they started establishing a command center, which was just on the other side of where the visiting room was. They had a command center set up there. Would have been the State Highway Patrol, would have been Department of Corrections that was set up there. The problem was early in the incident, and at that time, the Department of Corrections did not operate under an incident command system. And so the initial disturbance was reported as an inmate fight. And so all the shift supervisors, at least the majority, responded to L blocks. You had the shift commander, which was a lieutenant. He was seriously injured in the disturbance. So you have all your shift commanders, anyone in a leadership position, they were directly involved in the riot. And so that's why initially when we were there within the first couple hours, the reason didn't appear to be anyone in charge because there wasn't, because the staff had been seriously injured. The supervisory staff had been seriously injured.
Yeah, I think a lot of it came down to, some of the individual supervisors and staff would just say, hey, that we got to do this. Let's get some people together and let's make it happen. I mean, that night we went out on the yard. I know that's what happened. I mean, to a point. I'm sure somewhere somebody high up said it, but we had a sergeant from SOCF that was pretty much running the show as far as communications with the command and all that. That's who was running it, and I mean that's how far down the chain of command it went.
Let me ask this. So, you look at some of the documentation about Lucasville Riot and so forth. There was a lot of law enforcement components that responded from the local PD to the State Highway Patrol, that sort of thing. Did these other components, did they kind of stay in the periphery and just help with provide additional assistance, maintaining the perimeter, that sort of thing, or did they kind of get in the middle of things and try to run the show?
I'm not aware of any of them getting involved in, correct me if I'm wrong, Darren, but the State Highway Patrol, I mean, they were instrumental, and they had their newly formed special response team. They were in with us. Eventually when they all got there, they were in with us, and their upper echelon obviously was in the command post and helping out any way they could. But as far as taking over, no one.
Okay, so they
and then as far as
they didn't take over the command and control.
No.
Okay.
No. And the local law enforcement, there are a couple local police departments there in the county, as well as the sheriff's office. They essentially, as you alluded to, they were tasked with perimeter security and helping maintain traffic flow and that type of thing. And then, as Chris mentioned, the Highway Patrol Special Response Team was there, and then their commander would have been within that command group, or at least a liaison would have been within the command group. But there was little doubt that throughout that entire riot that the calls are any decisions were being made by central office, even though there was an instant command post there at SOCF. All the decisions were being made by central office and the governor's office.
As that night ends and you start going into the next day, that's when there starts to be some type of leadership established with, it seems to be, with the inmate population as far as who's going to be their spokesperson.
Well, as far as I know, the first person inmate wise to make contact with the negotiate, with anyone from corrections was that Skates that you heard about when he come out with his bullhorn. And I was actually in the tower as a sniper when he come out, and I believe it was a state trooper. I can't swear to it. It is a state trooper or someone from the FBI was talking from our tower, was talking to him from our tower.
I know they were in the process of activating within the department. We had hostage negotiation teams, so they were in the process of getting them ramped up. But the key was to try to get communication going, because there had been so much damage to L's side. It was hard to get. They were trying to find a way to communicate and share information. So initially, it was just, as Chris mentioned, it was through a lot of through bullhorns on the yard as far as conveying information. And they finally got to the point where they were able to have some phone conversations between the hostage negotiation team and the inmates. Unfortunately, the inmates had access to the hostage negotiation manual that the department used, because there was an employee at SOCF that had the hostage negotiation manual in their office. And so the inmates had the playbook. So they knew what we were going to try to do as far as from a negotiation standpoint. And that posed some challenges.
Real quick question. You spoke of there were some units in the L block side that were being renovated. Did the inmates ever gain access to those areas that you're aware of?
As far as I know, they had access, as I recall, to all, because they had the keys. So they had access to all the cell blocks on L side, because they were instigating some of the K block, or the K side, or K block inmates to try to get them to engage in the riot as well. We actually had to go in and put that down on, I think it was about day 3, as I recall, it was around day 3.
Okay. And were there any tools, any equipment that were left behind by the renovation crew?
I don't know definitively. I would suspect no, because if it's like most facilities, you check the tools going in, you check them going out. They don't remain in that area whenever it's not actively being worked.
Are you being briefed that we went from 2 hostages to more hostages to more hostages and so on?
And not that I was not in real time, no.
If I remember correctly, could be wrong, that when they initially started negotiations, they said, hey, we'll release 2 hostages, but we want to talk to a TV or radio host, whatever. They did not honor that request.
Yeah.
Later, they did, but I think it was at the expense of maybe Officer Vallandigham. I don't know that for a fact. That's why I'm asking, do you know why that may not have happened in the beginning for some reason or another, if I'm correct? Because we know today, if someone says we're going to release hostages, God damn it, we're going to bend over backwards to get them released. And that's just what we do. And I just wondered why that particular request wasn't honored right then. Maybe it was too chaotic. Maybe there was something behind the scenes that we don't know. And that was the reason why I was asking the question.
I'll go back and look at once again that season in Lucasville, because it does a really good job of outlining the timeline. Because as I recall, the first hostage was released after Bobby was murdered and his body brought out, because that's whenever there was the negotiator was from the Dayton Police Department, and I remember they brought them in and they talked about how there's been a major breakthrough in negotiations, and because up to that point, anything you've ever been told, any type of special operations training, is once they start harming or killing hostages, negotiations are over. And so that was the first instance I recall of, an officer being released was after Bobby was murdered and his body was brought out.
Yeah.
Was there any intel that was gathered from the tunnels with the listening devices?
I don't know what they got out of that. I'm sure they were recording every bit of it and going over it, but what they got out of it, I don't really know. I don't know. I mean,
we were listening. There were listening devices there. Of course, sometimes it's hard to hear. There's so much chaos, and it's there were only certain places they were able to successfully place the listening devices, and so nobody caught during that time that they were talking about killing an officer. And now later, when they went back through all the tapes, they did hear discussion about they were going to kill an officer because they didn't think the state was taking them serious.
The captive documentary brought it up, but they moved the inmates around pretty regularly, didn't they? I'm sorry,
yes,
the hostages.
So.
They moved the hostages around.
Yeah.
Quite often. So
because they knew we were probably formulating an assault plan,
right?
And they moved them on a regular basis.
Okay. It's interesting hearing them talk about how they were, when they were passed to the different group, how they were treated differently as they were moved around.
So midway through the siege, negotiations were ongoing, but tensions remained high. At this point, no staff hostages were killed, although some were badly beaten. On Thursday, April 15th, 1993, 5 days later, at 11:05 a.m., everything, and I mean everything, changed. The body of Correctional Officer Robert Vallandigham was placed on a recreation yard by 4 inmates. Can you talk us through that very moment, about the shock, the anger, the sadness, and all the emotions, including your heart falling into the pit of your stomach?
So, inmates they're creatures of habit. They do things the same. They just always, their behavior is typically consistent. prior to that time, they had brought bodies out, and they would throw the body down. They may kick it, or they would scream obscenities at us and do different things, and they would linger on the yard. And so Chris can certainly talk to his part in a moment, because he was in one of the towers. I was looking at a closed circuit TV view. I was actually on a telephone call with another officer back at our home institution, and I saw the inmates, carrying a body. It was clear it was a body, except this time it was covered in a white sheet. And so the inmates carried the body out. They laid the body down. Unlike previous instances, they laid the body down. It was almost like it was a funeral procession. And once they laid his body down, they paused for a second, and then they immediately went back to that L-side gymnasium. And to me, it was in that moment that I was on the phone with a fellow officer, said, I've got to go. They just brought a dead officer out. And they asked me, how do you know? And so I kind of went through what I just did with you. And so I made a beeline for our officer, back where our team was located, to let them know I'm 99% sure this is an officer that they just brought out. And then Chris was in the tower, and he could speak to what he saw there.
Well, I'd been up in the tower. At that point, I don't know how long. I mean, at least overnight, and it gotten daylight, and like I said, it was, around 11 o'clock. And we were all tired in the tower. I mean, there was 5 of us up there, and it was all quiet. Everything had been quiet for a while. We hadn't really gotten much direction from anything. There hadn't been any activity on the yard or anything like that. So we honestly, all of us were just relaxing a little bit, trying to catch, a little, close our eyes a little bit and relax. And for whatever reason, I raised my head up, and just about the time that I did it, I'm looking, trying to focus, and I see these 4 inmates. I couldn't actually see the door they come out of from where I was. But when they broke the corner of the building, there's 4 inmates carrying what was obviously a body in a sheet. They were moving as quickly as they could. Obviously, it was a heavy, very heavy person, and it was moving around a lot. My first thought, and I communicated with the tower next to me, our first thought, they're going to come out and kill somebody on the yard to make a point to get things moving, or whatever their point was. That's what the first thing that went through my mind, because I knew it was a body. It almost looked like, the way they were carrying it, and they were humping it pretty good at the time, it almost looked like they were struggling with it. So first thing that come through my mind, it's alive. They've got somebody restrained in there. They're going to come out. They're going to pull the sheet off, and they're going to do whatever. I was ready. Safety off the rifle. Scope on the guy's back. I mean, they've been over, laid the body down. My crosshair was on the guy's shoulder. When he stood up, I was going to have a direct shot at his chest. The tower next to me had the other two, on the other end, had the other 2 that he was going to take care of if it came to that. And they laid the body down, stood up, didn't offer any further abuse to it, stood up just for a brief second, and they hightailed it back to where they come from. As far as well, there was no communication on the radio. And in the recording, you can actually hear me on the radio saying, "Did you guys know they just brought a body out?" And after that, they sent a retrieval team out, and we all knew what it was. And I watched them retrieve the body, and I knew, there was no doubt in my mind at that point, just from their actions, what it was. And shortly thereafter, they got us relieved out of the towers, thank God. And but yeah, that's what it was. And throughout my remaining years in the department, you hear all kinds of, well, they threw him out the window. Did you hear they threw him out the window? And no, they didn't do that. They carried him out, laid him down, and walked and run back in. But yeah, and by watching that, the way they acted, yeah, you knew right off what it was.
And it's been 33 years. It'll be 33 years in April. Just a little less than a month away now when that happened. and I can see that as clearly in my eyes and in my memory as I could the day it happened. And
Yep.
to Chris's point about where it looked like maybe that there was a body moving, it was really windy that day, because I remember once they laid the body down, you could see that the wind was blowing so hard that the sheet was rippling, and so you could see the sheet moving. And it's just because it was so windy that day. But
Yeah,
like I
as
said,
a
it was
lifer, that was our nightmare, because we just would sit up there and try to gauge the wind, and there would just be whirlwinds, between them buildings, and you could just see the trash just blowing every which direction, and there was always wind down there on that yard, and yeah, it was very windy.
And so, like I said, there was no doubt based on what we saw that I knew, once again, just based on previous behavior, I knew what it was, and our team was prepped and ready to go. And it wasn't long after that I passed Warden Tate in the hallway, and his look confirmed what I already knew at that point. And that's when we thought we were absolutely going in. Everything we'd ever been trained, we were going in. And then to your question earlier about how did you feel? We knew we were going in until we were told that there had been an improvement, a dramatic improvement in negotiations. And at that point, you just kind of felt deflated, because at that point, we thought we were really going to go in and get control of the situation, because our fear was they've killed one, how many more are they going to kill? And we're just
If they
standing here idly by and doing nothing.
if they hadn't already, I mean,
Exactly. We didn't know, because they weren't able to confirm the status of a lot of the officers. There was a few that could.
There was no proof of life, and we didn't know when he had been killed. If they'd have killed him, earlier on, and this is just now bringing his body out. We didn't know. So
Yeah.
Well, that's a horrific turning point in the entire incident, and it's one that changes everything.
I just want to reiterate that, and I know Darren feels the same way. That this is what we saw from our perspective, and we're not trying to. And what it's 33 years ago. If we've made a mistake, I don't want anybody's family to come back and say that, them guys, are saying this or that. But this is what we saw in our perspective. And me and Darren have talked, and, I think we're on pretty good for what we've talked about. We're pretty confident of what we're saying. But anyway, I want to take the light from anybody else's, experience. I mean, this is just our experience, and hopefully somebody can learn from it. And that's why we're doing this.
Well, I think when you take a look at the totality of all the information that is out there, and there's a variety of there's a documentary on Netflix, Captive. There's other shows or other YouTube podcasts or different things that are out there that are discussing this. And what you all have just brought up, like you said, is just the information that you had, the perspective that you saw it from. And we do appreciate you bringing that, because it is important to talk to the people who were there, because that's how we gain the lessons for the future. Chris Kemper, Darren Price, thank you so much for being here tonight and bringing the information, your personal experiences along. And we really appreciate the fact that you're going through the pain, because like you said, Darren, it's so close to the anniversary date. And we appreciate that you're going through all of this with us. So from Corrections Unfiltered, we want to say thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Appreciate it, guys.
Yes, thank you very
you.
much.